A land where glory and betrayal intertwine like steel and fire, where kings crave power and common men fight for immortality. A name emerges that would resonate through the centuries, a name that defied kingdoms and changed the course of history. Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, known as El Cid Campeador. This is the story of a warrior who rides between honor and survival. It's the tale of an exile who conquered his place in the world with steel and cunning, facing more powerful and numerous enemies. In these hostile lands where every dawn could be the last, the Cid became a legend. He will achieve bloody victories, be hated and loved, meet kings and knights, defend oaths, and above all his honor. This is the story of the Criminal Investigation Department, the Champion. As always, let's start with some context. We have the Kingdom of Leon, ruled by Fernando of Leon, which had just reached its peak but was now ruled by Garcia Sanchez III. We have the newly born Kingdom of Aragon, ruled by Sancho I, and finally the County of Barcelona. What was happening? Well, in the process of reconquest, all the kingdoms or counties expanded to the south, conquering territory from the Taifa kingdoms. And what was the idea of Fernando I, the protagonist of today's episode? He decided to cut off the future expansionism of the rest of the Christian territories, conquering the territories to the south of these. That is, the Taifa of Zaragoza and the Taifa of Valencia. In this way, the rest of the peninsula would be at his mercy alone. In the year 1060, he attacked the Taifa of Zaragoza and managed to make it swear vassalage to him. And why vassalage? And didn't he conquer it entirely? By swearing vassalage, Zaragoza had to pay him annual tributes. In addition, if any Christian kingdom expanded into the territory of the Taifa, the Kingdom of Leon would have casus belli to stop them. It's a way to gain territory little by little. I must point out that until that moment, Zaragoza had been a vassal of Pamplona. But after a war between Leon and Pamplona, the Zaragozans broke their vassalage agreement with the latter kingdom. 2 years later, it was the turn of the Taifa of Toledo, where he did the same, as well as with the Taifa of Seville. In the year 1065, he decided it was time to curb the expansionism of the other Christian kingdoms, and for this he launched the campaign to take Valencia. At the beginning of that year, he left Zaragoza with his troops heading to Valencia, where he ruled, a weak king who was nothing more than a puppet of the King of Toledo. And what were the defenses of Valencia like? The walls were solid, of good quality, and the men who defended them were well-trained and high-spirited. So it was going to be a tough nut to crack. In addition, the city had a series of towers around it located a few kilometers away from the walls. These were watchtowers that would allow the defenders to be warned of the arrival of a threat, as well as delay them. In the spring of the year 1065, the Leonese troops arrived at one of the towers, the Tower of Paterna, on top of which a large bonfire was lit. To alert the defenders that a Leonese army was approaching, Fernando ordered to take the tower, which, being caught by surprise, fell with little resistance. After this, he left a small detachment in that tower, established his large camp there, and marched with his troops towards the city. You've often asked me what the place where I edit is like, haven't you? I'm going to tell you something. Taste of history. Why am I dressed as a medieval soldier? Man, well, I have to play the part, right? If I want to edit history videos. Well, here I have a wooden square with junk. As you can see, the mess here is impressive, but how can it shake so much? I need a taller table, so I bring a table that would change everything. How easy, right? Those problems are over. It's like playing Now I Go Up, Now I Go Down. With a capacity of up to 275 pounds and unmatched stability, I can raise it if I want to work standing up. No, I'm already tired of standing. Now I'm going to work sitting down. Oh, you want a camera of mine, huh? Well, look. In the description you can find the link that will take you directly to the page of the
table.
SD Pro from FlexiSpot. A wonder. Many thanks to FlexiSpot for sending me the table. And now please go, I want to work standing up for a bit. The first thing he did after arriving in front of the walls was to send troops to cover each of the city gates, so that nothing and no one could enter. He was besieging the city. But of course Fernando had no fleet. So through the Turia, the Muslims could continue receiving supplies. The Leonese troops began building siege weapons such as battering rams and siege towers. But this did not fully convince the monarch, as an assault against the city would be very costly in casualties. He had to think of another way to take it. But not because it was impregnable, but because the Leonese army did not have enough numerical superiority to assault a city and be able to take it, assuming the casualties they were going to suffer. As a note, simplifying it a lot, there are 3 ways to take a city. The first, less costly in men but very costly in time and supplies, is the siege. Sieging a city involves blocking the entry and exit of people and supplies from that city. For what? Well, first of all, to starve them out, forcing them to surrender due to hunger, but that's not the only reason. With no way out, the city's dead remain inside. And even though they can be incinerated, buried, use lime anyway, in various ways, so to speak, getting rid of the bodies exponentially increases the possibility of an epidemic. What is sought with the site is that the city surrenders without a fight. You can also force an exit of the defenders who, in desperation, try to break the siege. If they make an exit and fail, the number of defenders is reduced. So an assault would be more viable. And here comes the second way, the direct assault on the city. For this, siege machines are needed, like towers, battering rams, or ladders, or depending on the era, artillery pieces to smash the walls. This way is fast, yes, quite fast, but very costly in men. And the last way is a betrayal from within. Someone who opens the city gates to the invader, so that they can enter without having to take the walls. Of these 3 ways, the last one was not within Fernando's reach. The assault option was also not viable. As I mentioned, the Leonese army could not sustain all those losses. And the siege option was viable, but of course the city could be supplied by the river. And Fernando couldn't trust his supply lines as they passed through the Taifa of Zaragoza, which was a vassal, yes, but it was Muslim. And I ask you, what would you do if you were in Fernando Pausad's place? The video and leave me in the comments that you already know that I always read you, even though I can't answer everyone. Well then, Fernando launched a timid assault with ladders against the walls. That was destined to fail. And indeed, as soon as the Leonese soldiers put the ladders against the walls, the rain of projectiles became unbearable. And even before the first Leonese climbed the walls, the monarch ordered the retreat. A disorderly retreat, ordering to leave behind all the siege equipment, supplies, tents, firewood, everything. The Muslims, seeing this disorderly flight due to a small defeat, assumed that the Leonese morale was very low. So in a hurry, they gathered their troops at the city gates and rushed out in pursuit of the enemy. The Leonese arrived at the Tower of Paterna, and the troops formed next to it waiting for the arrival of the Muslims. But to appear weaker, probably part of the Christian army stayed in the rear, making the front shorter but deeper. The Saracen troops arrived, and seeing the weakness of the enemy, they pounced on them. The Leonese formed a wall of shields and resisted the charge with tenacity, fighting for their king. The Muslim troops kept arriving and accumulating at the battlefront. Then at a signal from Fernando, probably, The troops that were in the rear launched themselves on the flanks, spreading out across the battlefield and surrounding the Muslims, as if it were a pincer. Because not the entire Valencian army was there, the Leonese enjoyed a notable numerical superiority, and took advantage of this not only to attack the flanks, but to continue expanding and reach the Saracen rear. The surrounded Muslims began to be skewered by Christian spears and swords. In fact, the king of the Taifa of Valencia, who was fighting, had to sacrifice his personal guard, so that they would open a path for him to escape at a gallop to the safety of his walls. The siege on the Valencian army gradually closed in, pressing, tightening from all directions, just as it happened in the Battle of Cannae, 1200 years ago. Of course, the Saracens were completely eliminated or taken prisoner. The army of the Taifa of Valencia had disappeared. Now he could indeed take the city. To the assault, Fernando ordered to return in front of the walls of Valencia and resume the construction of the siege machines. However, he began to feel sick. Indisposed and fearing for his life, he ordered to lift the siege and return to his kingdom. On the 27th of December of that same year, Fernando died. I got a big problem. Unlike the Visigothic or Asturian tradition, which prevented the kingdom from being divided, after the monarch's death, Fernando had decided that the kingdom should be considered family heritage, and he divided it among his children. Doña Urraca was named Lady of Zamora, Doña Elvira, Lady of Toro. Sancho II would be the King of Castilla, Alfonso VI would be the King of Leon, and Garcia would be the King of Galicia. A series of wars between brothers was about to unleash, and among them all would be the Criminal Investigation Department. December 27, 1065. Fernando I, King of the Kingdom of Leon, died, leaving in his will that his kingdom be divided among his 3 sons. The kingdom of Galicia was given to Garcia, the youngest son, who would receive the tributes from the taifas of Badajoz and Seville. The kingdom of Leon was given to Alfonso VI, the middle son, who would receive the tributes from the taifa of Toledo, while the eldest son received the county of Castile, which his father had ordered to be converted into a kingdom for his son. So here we have the birth of the kingdom of Castile, and would receive the tributes from Zaragoza. The problem, among others, is that the imperial title fell on the monarch of Leon. Sancho appointed the Criminal Investigation Department as the Alfonsquires of Castilla, since they were against the distribution. After the death of their mother in the year 1067, hostilities broke out between Sancho and Alfonso for the crown of Leon. The Criminal Investigation Department set off with the Castilian Mesnadas to confront the Leonese. And on the 19th of July of the year 1068, the Battle of Llantada took place. There, both monarchs agreed that the winner of the battle would keep both kingdoms. But despite the fact that the Criminal Investigation Department won in the name of Sancho, Alfonso refused to surrender the Kingdom of Leon. After the battle, both armies returned to their respective kingdoms. There was no new battle for the time being. Each monarch decided to strengthen their kingdom internally, although Alfonso had something else in mind. As I mentioned, the Kingdom of Leon was entitled to the pariahs from the Taifa of Toledo. But Alfonso thought it was not enough, so he decided to invade the Taifa of Badajoz to collect its pariahs, which, according to the testament, belonged to his brother Garcia. Be that as it may, Alfonso reached Badajoz, and without the need for a big fight, the Taifal king capitulated and agreed to swear vassalage to the Kingdom of Leon and give him the pariahs. And you might ask, didn't Garcia do anything? He remained vigilant and focused on his own affairs. Perhaps because at that moment he was quelling the rebellion in the county of Portugal. However, it was a brutal display of weakness. So many nobles began to look suspiciously at their monarch. Something they realized. Alfonso and Sancho. And on the 26th of May of the year 1069, Alfonso and Sancho signed the peace, agreeing to face a common enemy, their brother Garcia. The agreement, supported by their sisters Urraca and Elvira, stipulated that Galicia would be divided between Alfonso and Sancho, and it would be Sancho who would be in charge of defeating Garcia, for which Alfonso gave him military access to his kingdom. In the year 1071, the Castilian host crossed Leon, entered Galicia and crushed the army of Galicia, even capturing Garcia himself, who was soon exiled to the Taifa of Seville. The north of Galicia was given to the Kingdom of Castile, while the south to the Kingdom of Leon. Would there now be peace between both brothers? No, and now it's even more difficult. That Galician territory under Castilian power is more of a problem than an advantage, as it is not connected by land to the rest of Castile, which makes its administration very, very complicated. Now it's more of a duty than anything else to try to conquer the Kingdom of Leon, to achieve a land continuity of Castile. Therefore, at the end of the year 1071, King Sancho marched with Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar to fight against Alfonso to conquer the kingdom. They departed with their troops, and on the 11th of January of the year 1072, the Battle of Golpejera took place. Everyone knew what was at stake that day. The victor would rule both kingdoms and the loser would be executed, imprisoned, or exiled. Were they aware that they were going to fight a decisive battle that would be remembered by history? At sunrise after breakfast, both armies formed face to face, Sancho and his faithful Rodrigo against Alfonso. Without elaborate tactics, without projectiles, a tough hand-to-hand fight, cavalry on the wings, heavy infantry in the center. After Sancho's signal, El Chito ordered the advance of the Castilian army. Seeing this, Alfonso ordered the Leonese advance. Both armies advanced towards the center of the battlefield, and at a reasonable distance they charged one against the other. Warriors were fighting who just 7 years ago belonged to the same army and fought shoulder to shoulder. Now they were enemies. Same similar fighting style, experience, and even numbers. The front did not yield on either side. At times the Castilian troops managed to push the Leonese center, forcing them to retreat. But then the Leonese drew strength from weakness, stopped retreating, and began to press, now forcing the Castilians to give ground. The hours passed and neither side managed to claim victory, no matter how much the monarchs of both kingdoms encouraged their men to achieve victory. Midday arrived and the warriors managed to get a piece of bread to their mouths when they were relieved and sent to the reserve. But the fatigue was immense, and then something broke in the Castilian forces. Sancho's troops began to retreat. The wings were dangerously giving way, and Rodrigo was going from side to side, instilling courage in his men in the name of the king. The sun began to set on the horizon, and the icy night began to gain ground, causing the temperature to drop rapidly. These were not conditions to fight, let alone if what was expected was a retreat. Sancho ordered the withdrawal. The Castilian troops turned around and fled from the battlefield. Alfonso the Leonese had won. As the chronicle tells, the fight was enormous. The dead carpeted the battlefield, turning the snow red. Alfonso had before him the possibility of ordering the pursuit of the Castilian army, which was in retreat. But considering that his men were exhausted, reluctant to attack retreating Christians, and fearful that the Castilians might ambush him at night, he didn't order any pursuit. Sancho was devastated, his army shattered, scattered across the Palatine Plain, the icy fields, the falling snow, and morale was at rock bottom. But then, Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar came to his side, and with a firm voice he said, "As long as there is a king and swords to defend him, is it possible to turn the tide of fate?" It was not a time for lamentations. Sancho regained his morale, and together with his loyal standard-bearer, they scoured the Palatine Plain, gathering their army. Not everything was lost, The Castilian army was united again. The gears of the kingdom were back in motion. For the Galicians and the Leonese, the war had ended. For the Castilians, it had just begun. After briefly resting and having breakfast without fires, the Castilian army quietly approached the Leonese camp. The close night of deep winter prevented them from being spotted by the guard pickets. The snow muffled their footsteps and the freezing wind carried the sounds to distant lands. The Leonese had spent the night celebrating and were now resting. At the break of dawn, Sancho launched his battle cry. El Cid echoed it, and the entire Castilian army abandoned stealth and charged like a demon army against Alfonso's tents. There was no need for the pickets to sound the alarm. Everyone knew the Castilians were coming, but no one was prepared. Small groups of Leonese and Galicians offered timid resistance, but they were swept away by the Castilian momentum. And a victory tastes good, but a victory just a few hours after a defeat tastes 1,000 times better. Alfonso's soldiers were crushed, executed, and taken prisoner. An hour earlier, they were masters of the kingdom of Leon and Castile. Now they had nothing. Alfonso himself fled from the battlefield but was captured shortly after. That same day, the 12th of January, Sancho entered the city of Leon, where he was crowned monarch of the kingdom of Leon. That, yes, with the opposition of the Leonese nobility. And this is a problem. Remember that we are in the Middle Ages, and the power of a king is not absolute, but is based on the power of his nobility. So the monarchs have to keep their nobles happy. And indeed, numerous nobles opposed to Sancho took up arms. And do you know where they set up their base of operations? In Zamora? And why in Zamora? Because Doña Urraca, daughter of Fernando and sister of Sancho and Alfonso, was the lady of Zamora, and was against Sancho. Zamora was a key piece of the kingdom. It protected the Duero, served as a connection between the north and the south, had been dismantled by Almanzor and rebuilt again, and it had impressive walls. There went the Castilian troops led by King Sancho himself. There took place what is known as the Siege of Zamora. The city was besieged and preparations began to launch an assault against the walls. During the following months, timid assaults were launched against the defenses, but they always resulted in defeats. Zamora was impregnable, but then there was a dramatic turn of events. It turns out that Belido Adolfos, a Leonese noble serving Urraca, left the city with a white flag and approached the Castilian camp, claiming that he wanted to switch to the Castilian side. For weeks, this man earned Sancho's trust, until on the 7th of October that year they set off to oversee the work at Axidal. Once alone, Belido Adolfo stabbed the Castilian monarch in the back and ran towards the safety of the walls. Pursued by the Criminal Investigation Department, Belido Adolfos managed to cross the walls through a small gate, known as the Gate of Betrayal, although now renamed as the Small Gate of Loyalty. However, the betrayal arises from various songs, and it's also not certain that it happened as such. What is certain is that Sancho died in the siege, leaving the kingdom of Leon without a monarch, and who could be the king? Well, Alfonso VI returned from exile to be crowned again as the monarch of Leon, less than a year after having lost the crown. But he wouldn't be the only one to return, for Garcia took the opportunity to return from exile and reclaim the crown of Galicia. He partly succeeded, but only for a short time. On February 13, 1973, he attended a meeting that Alfonso had organized in Leon. Honestly, I don't know what Garcia expected from that meeting, given the struggles of the recent years. But as it was, I think it was to be expected. Alfonso imprisoned Garcia and sent him to the castle of Luna, where he would spend the rest of his days until his death, in the year 1090. Conclusion: Alfonso now had all the territory that his father had ruled, a loyal and united kingdom, as without opposition, all the nobility had sworn vassalage to him. However, the Castilian nobility looked with suspicion at the new monarch, and to appease these suspicions, Alfonso ingratiated himself with Rodrigo, giving him positions and tasks of high responsibility. But we will know this in the next chapter. Year 1080. The situation in Toledo is tricky for the Taifa, as there has been a small civil war in which the king has been exiled and taken in by Alfonso VI, King of Leon, who he asks for help to recover the Taifa. And indeed, the Leonese monarch set out to besiege the city. But to prevent the other Taifas from coming to help, he devised a strategy from Toledo. Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, known as El Cid Campeador, was sent to collect the pariahs from the Taifa of Seville, as well as renewing his oath of vassalage, which included protection against foreign threats. In this way, he would manage to intimidate the civilians. But there's more. The same Leonese monarch sent Garcia Ordóñez to the Taifa of Granada, also a tributary of the King of Leon, to collect the tributes and to something very important: convince them to attack the Taifa of Seville, so that the Saracens are busy with internal squabbles. However, there was probably a miscalculation. It turns out that El Cid probably spent more time than expected in Seville, and when the Granada invasion began, he kept his word that he had given the kingdom to defend its vassals, that is, to defend Seville. El Cid ordered his Christian host, reinforced by civilian troops, to march against the invading army. Didn't he know that there were also Leonese troops on the other side? Garcia Ordóñez, for his part, did not know that he was facing El Cid. The battle was quick and the Granadans were destroyed and expelled. Garcia Ordóñez was taken prisoner. Thus began his hatred for Rodrigo, which he would take advantage of the following year. It turns out that Alfonso had managed to take Toledo and had returned it to the legitimate king of the Taifa, Alcadir, in exchange for a deal. When Alcadir also regained Valencia, Toledo would be peacefully handed over to the Kingdom of Leon. That was the Christian dream since Pelayo defended Covadonga to recover the old Visigothic capital. It turns out that a small Toledo host launched a harvest on the border with Leon, to which the Criminal Investigation Department responded with an incursion into Toledo lands. Alfonso VI, upon finding out, flew into a rage, because he didn't want his fragile agreement with Toledo to be ruined by a mere raid. He made a tough decision. As punishment, he ordered the exile of the Criminal Investigation Department. If in the fall of the year 1081, the Criminal Investigation Department had to leave the kingdom with all his loyal followers and find a new way of life. What he did best was to fight, so he decided to continue doing so. As a mercenary, he went to the county of Barcelona, where he offered his services, but he was rejected. Next destination, Zaragoza. Being a vassal of Leon, she could acquire the services of Rodrigo without damaging the honor of the Criminal Investigation Department. But that same year, King Taiful died, which triggered a civil war between his two sons, Al-Mutamin, the heir to the kingdom, and Almandir, the usurper. Al-Mutamin controlled Zaragoza, while Almandir controlled Lerida, and the CID was on the side of Zaragoza. The fame of the champion was well known in the peninsula, so Almandir asked for outside help, specifically from the counts of Barcelona and the King of Aragon. The usurper's troops, supported by soldiers from Barcelona, besieged Almanar, where they faced the circus hosts who came to the rescue of the city. The Battle of Almanar took place, where Rodrigo emerged victorious. However, the Taifa of Lerida would remain independent.
Now they would come.
A series of years in which there would be various battles on the Valencian coast. But something that happened in the center of the peninsula must be highlighted. In the year 1085, the city of Toledo capitulated to the troops of Alfonso VI. This event had international significance. All of Christendom praised the Leonese monarch. For Toledo was the ancient capital of the Visigothic kingdom, also the ancient capital of Christianity on the peninsula, and it was also so important that the Taifa kingdoms were frightened and asked for help from abroad. To whom? To Yusuf and his Almoravids, and the Battle of Sagrajas will take place, which I detail in the video that I leave for you up here. After the disaster of Sagrajas, Alfonso saw the need to weave alliances everywhere with Barcelona, Navarra, European powers, and of course with the Criminal Investigation Department. In 1087, the long-awaited reconciliation between the Criminal Investigation Department and Alfonso VI occurred. In this reconciliation, the Leonese monarch entrusted Criminal Investigation Department with the defense of Levante, that is, the protection of Zaragoza and Valencia. And in exchange, all the lands that Rodrigo conquered would be his property. And he didn't have to wait for duty to call him, as Salmundir, king of the Taifa of Lerida, and the Count of Barcelona launched an offensive to take the city of Valencia. Although stopped by the Criminal Investigation Department's army, they only managed to take Sagunto. Then he was called by Alfonso to defend Aledo, which was going to be besieged by Yusuf, who had returned to the peninsula to continue his conquest. However, ladies and gentlemen, the Criminal Investigation Department did not come to his aid. And even though Aledo resisted and the Almoravids had to withdraw, Alfonso decreed a second exile for the Criminal Investigation Department. But this Rodrigo was not the same as a few years ago. Now he had built his own political entity, based in Calamocha, collecting some tributes from the lands between Valencia, Cuenca, Teruel, and Castellón. His neighbors did not like this. And in the year 1090, the king of Lerida, Almundir, whom we already know, offered a campaign to Zaragoza, Aragon, and Barcelona to defeat the CID. However, only Berenguer, Ramon II, Count of Barcelona, came to his aid. In the summer of the year 1090, Rodrigo's troops presented battle in the Pinar de Tebar. El Criminal Investigation Department was outnumbered, so his positions were between two lush forests at the foot of a hill, so that he could not be flanked during the battle. He also had an ace up his sleeve. Muslim light troops at his service were ambushed in the nearby woods. Ready to pounce on any careless enemy that passed by, he just needed to guide the enemy to them. Rodrigo ordered a group of loyal soldiers, men he trusted, to flee in terror near the enemy camp, as if they were running from something, and most importantly, to let themselves be captured by the enemy. For what? They were supposed to tell the Count of Barcelona, who was leading the enemy coalition, false stories about the Criminal Investigation Department's positions. They were supposed to tell him that morale was at rock bottom, that the army was small and disintegrating, and that small groups of troops were leaving one way or another. Precisely the roads where the Muslims were ambushed. Berenguer Ramon fell into the trap. By mid-morning, a significant part of the army set off in the direction that the Criminal Investigation Department soldiers told them, separating into smaller groups to cover all the directions they had been indicated. Little by little, they moved away from the bulk of the host, and out of sight at a distant distance, they were ambushed by the Muslims. There were no survivors from those columns. Their screams were drowned out by the density of the forest, and none were allowed to escape and alert the Count. With this trick, the Criminal Investigation Department had achieved numerical superiority on the battlefield. While this was happening, the center of the coalition began to advance, seeing victory within their grasp. The Criminal Investigation Department waited motionless with his troops, ready to resist the charge in a good formation without flaws. But then Rodrigo realized that he was not the only one with surprises. Behind him, from the rear of his army, enemy troops appeared at the top of the hill from among the trees. running downhill to pounce on their unprotected backs. Was it a trap? Berenguer Ramon during the night had ordered that a significant group of foot knights surround Rodrigo's positions, penetrate the forests and ascend the hill without being seen, ready to charge. When the battle began, El Criminal Investigation Department, aware of his numerical superiority, decided to launch an attack against the enemy center. He commanded a few soldiers to create a shield wall and withstand the surprise attack, while he, along with his cavalry and the vanguard, charged against the enemy coalition. The Count of Barcelona's center was destroyed. The cavalry charge had been lethal, and enemy soldiers were falling by the dozens, by the hundreds. However, during the charge, Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, the Cid Campeador, was seriously injured and fell from his mount, getting lost among his men. Once the momentum of the charge was lost and the riders lost the advantage, the Criminal Investigation Department's infantry charged after their cavalry, slipping through the gaps that the knights had opened, and took over. The destruction of the enemy troops. These who did not expect such size push, who had lost cohesion, whose formation was completely disarrayed and whose morale was falling dangerously fast, were swept away. Meanwhile, the Count's knights charged against the Criminal Investigation Department's reserve, who, experienced and with spears at the ready, were able to cause casualties among the enemy and maintain the position long enough for the opposing vanguard to be eliminated. The knights on this side, after glimpsing the carnage that was taking place, turned around and started to run away from the battlefield. This battle was a decisive victory. Rodrigo, who survived the wound, collected almost 2 tons of gold for the ransom of the prisoners, among whom were the Count of Barcelona himself, Berenguer Ramon, and various nobles who were loyal to him. This military victory also extended to the political sphere. Aragon and Zaragoza were willing to agree on a military alliance with him. He had become the undisputed owner and protector of Levante, and was at the gates of Valencia. He was at his best when he received a letter from the wife of Alfonso VI, asking him to help her husband, the King of Leon, to stop Yusuf's expansionism. For he had decided to eliminate the Taifas and extend his empire to the peninsula. Rodrigo, understanding the danger this represented, accepted the request and set off to join the Leon army, which was heading south. Where to? Towards Granada? It turns out that the King of Granada asked Alfonso for help the moment he found out that Yusuf was after him. However, the Leonese were delayed and Granada fell, immediately followed by the Taifa of Malaga. The Almoravid stain spread quickly, gaining thousands and thousands of volunteers, who were disgusted with the weakness of the Taifa kings, and they saw in Yusuf a liberator who would return religious orthodoxy to Al-Andalus. However, we are going to continue focusing on the tip that we'll see, like Valencia, whose Taifa must defend, is going to be attacked by the Almoravids. Why? Well, because in the year 1094, only 2 Taifas survived the Almoravid invasion, the Taifa of Zaragoza and the Taifa of Valencia, as the one in Badajoz has just fallen. El Cid will have to fight separate battles to defend his interests and those of his vassals on the coast. But we will see this in the next chapter. In the year 1092, King Alfonso of Leon tried to finish his father's plan to curb the expansionism of the other Christian kingdoms on the peninsula, taking over Valencia. To do this, he tried to call a crusade in Europe, under the pretext of stopping the advance of the Almoravide. However, of all those who promised him help, no one came. The fleets of Genoa and Pisa didn't even set sail, and the armies of Aragon and Barcelona turned back before reaching Alfonso's meeting. Okay then, big problem. What was happening? That Valencia was a tributary of the TIT champion, and Alfonso's intention had not sat well with him. So he launched a punishment campaign against La Rioja, with no one able to stop him. The campaign was going well until at the end of summer he received a missive from Alcadir, king of the Taifa of Valencia. It turns out that there had been a coup in the city, and the faction in favor of the Almoravids had taken power. The new Qadir established what he called a government of true Muslims, and he immediately alerted the Saracen army in Murcia to begin its advance north. The Cid immediately cancelled his campaign and headed to Valencia, arriving in the fall. But of course, an assault on the city would be madness, at least with the Almoravid army so close. But then luck smiled on Rodrigo. The Almoravids decided that Lisbon was more important than Valencia, so they sent a small garrison to the city and sent the rest to the west, leaving the way clear for the Criminal Investigation Department to take the city. He was taking over the surroundings of Valencia, and in the year 1093, he sent a message to Valencia. If they surrendered and swore vassalage to him again, nothing would happen to them. Although they initially accepted, they quickly sent a message for help to the Almoravids to finish off the Criminal Investigation Department. Upon learning this, he besieged the city in September that year. But it wouldn't be until July of the year 1094 that Valencia would surrender, due to hunger. Valencia had just been reconquered by Christianity, after nearly 500 years under Muslim rule. The champion took the title of Prince Rodrigo, because, as Alfonso had signed years ago, everything that El Cid conquered would be the property of El Cid. But the peace and joy didn't last long. 2 months later, the Almoravids sent a huge army to retake the city. They sent it by sea to avoid an ambush by the Campador. An army of 30,000 Saracens on the 13th of September disembarked and settled near the current Guardia Poble. And what could the Criminal Investigation Department do? Well, he had 2,500 knights and 7,000 infantrymen. They outnumbered him by more than 3 to 1. He had to use all his wit to be able to win the battle, because remember that the Almoravids had not yet been defeated in the Iberian Peninsula. The first thing he did was to proclaim to the four winds that they had requested help from Kings Pedro I of Aragon and Alfonso VI of Leon, and that they were already on their way to expel the Almoravids. During the early morning of October 21st of the year 1094, the infantry of the Criminal Investigation Department, with him at the head, left through the south gate of the city. In the dark, with all the metal covered in garments and fabrics so that not even the slightest noise was made, they first advanced southward, without speaking, without torches, guided by the knowledge they already had of the terrain. After about 30 minutes of marching, they turned west and then continued marching, even more cautiously as they approached the Muslim camp. After overcoming the royal, the Saracens fell to the ground to rest, as the next day would be hard. They ate cold food for breakfast and stayed crouched among the grass to avoid being discovered. With the first rays of the sun, Rodrigo's knights came out of the west gate of the city with their banners held high and making a loud noise. The Almoravids thought that the Christians wanted to fight, so they arranged their entire army in battle order. Once formed, they advanced towards the Christian cavalry. These were far from the walls of Valencia. This encouraged the Saracens, for if they won, they would have enough time to crush the knights. On his part, Rodrigo's cavalry had orders to keep the Muslims as far away from their camp as possible. The Almoravid cavalry charged against the Christians, who in turn launched a countercharge. The Cid's cavalry was heavier, but the Saracens seemed victorious and was also superior in number. So they charged without fear. There was a thunderous clash between both cavalries, and after just a few minutes of fighting, the Christians ordered the retreat. Clearly seeing that suddenly, 2,500 heavy knights turn around and flee from the enemy army. The Almoravid morale shot through the roof, and they all launched in pursuit of the Christians. And then Rodrigo ordered the attack. The infantry of the champion rose and ran towards the Saracen camp. That's for sure, without flags so as not to be recognized by the Muslim troops that were there. The Almoravids, seeing an army charging at them from the west and seeing no flags, thought they were the reinforcements from Leon, and their morale plummeted. The Castilian troops stormed the camp and crushed all resistance they found, taking over the supplies and stored treasures. Possibly the Almoravid reserve would still be near the camp, and they would try to expel the Christians from there. But Rodrigo surely pounced on them and destroyed them without difficulty, ending any hope they might have of balancing the situation. They immediately launched in pursuit of the main Almoravid army, and as soon as the news spread, panic ensued. Then the knights stopped fleeing, turned around and charged against the Almoravid army. It was a massacre. Trapped between two fronts, the Almoravids tried to escape to the north and south, trying to get away from the Christian swords, but they were pursued and executed on the spot. Valencia was finally of Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar. During the next 3 years, the Criminal Investigation Department was able to reign his domains, gradually expanding his territories. Until in the year 1096, a new Almoravid army threatened to take the city. Again. They came from the south, and it was an army that once again far surpassed the forces of the Criminal Investigation Department. And despite having already managed to defeat them once in clear numerical inferiority, would he risk another encounter under those conditions? What he did was ask for help from Pedro I, and together in the year 1097, they headed south facing the Almoravids. In the Battle of Bayran, where the Christians emerged victorious, causing a large number of casualties among the Saracens. At last it seemed that the Muslims were at a loss. Valencia. So the Criminal Investigation Department dedicated himself to preparing a future lordship with its own independence around his son Diego. However, he would die in the Battle of Consuegra, which we will probably learn about in another video. The important thing here for Rodrigo, is that he had lost his only son, so his lineage would disappear with his own death. And it didn't take long to arrive. In the year 1099, Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, known as El Cid Campeador, died without an heir. His wife Jimena took over ruling his domains, but the task proved to be quite impossible. The Almoravids, upon learning of El Cid's death, began to press again, either by slowly advancing from the south or through propaganda. Since in Valencia itself, there were Islamic fundamentalists from the same faction that supported the coup against Al-Qadir. Social unrest began to increase, which made governance even more difficult. Finally, in August of the year 1101, the Almoravids arrived near Valencia and besieged the city, depriving it of resources, mainly food. This was a countdown. Without a strong leader, the Christians would lose the siege and be put to the sword. But Jimena had an ace up her sleeve. Now, it's not that she exhumed the corpse of the Criminal Investigation Department and mounted it on a horse to strike fear into the enemy. This is a legend that came much later than the actual events, which does sound good, but just think about what would be left of the Criminal Investigation Department's corpse 2 years after his death. What she actually did was ask Alfonso VI for help. He, leading his men, went to the city without hesitation and without even going into battle. The Saracens lifted the siege and abandoned the city. Okay, now we're going to zoom out the map and observe the borders of the Kingdom of Leon. But not only these that border the Almoravids, also those that border the other kingdoms. And add to these the ones from the taifas of Valencia, which has clearly shown that it cannot defend itself on its own. If he has to cover the entire border, either the defenses will be very weak or he will be left without a reserve army that can go to any point where it is necessary. Ladies and gentlemen, there was only one possible solution. In May of the year 1102, the Christians abandoned the city of Valencia, taking with them the corpse of Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, the Cid Campeador. And just 2 days later, on May 5th, The Almoravids entered the city and re-annexed it to the African Empire. Notice that from here they now have a base from which to launch attacks against the county of Barcelona and against the Taifa of Zaragoza, the only independent Muslim kingdom that resisted against the Almoravid pressure. 2 years later, in September of the year 1104, Pedro I of Aragon and Navarra would die without offspring. Do you know who would inherit the crown? Alfonso I the Battler.